Hi, everyone. So last time we talked about the controversies surrounding the book Ender's Game, and then we looked at the technology, things like trackers and desks and tablets and computer networks and the use of the internet for political purposes. So in that discussion, I got into a little bit about some of the sociological aspects of this book, the way that people are responding to Peter and Valentine, and their manipulation of information for political purposes or for future political purposes at least. And I wanted to talk more today about Ender's psychology because I actually think that psychology is an important component of this book that's often overlooked. As I mentioned before, a lot of people call this book a page turner. They look at it as kind of like a boys book or a young adult book that happens to have some military aspects of it. A lot of them look to the sequels and the rest of the series as being a little bit more for adults, and I don't think that that is true. And one of the reasons is that this psychological component, the characterization in this book, is really as important as the plot. And as we look at that hero's journey that we've been talking about, the call to adventure, the challenges and trials, the abyss, the atonement, the return, all of those steps, the need for mentors, the magical aid, all of that kind of stuff. As we look at that, I think you can really follow Ender. Again, his age is 6. You heard me kind of talk about that before. But if you look at it as a coming of age book, whether he's going from 6 to 12 or 12 to 18, he really is developing and maturing. So there's a few things that you need to know in terms of history here. And the first is the voluntary sports societies of the Soviet Union. So why would that be important to this book? Because the way that Ender is chosen for this military school is very similar to the way that children were chosen to be in these sports schools. So in the Soviet Union, beginning in 1935 and ending in about 1991, when we had the collapse of the USSR, you had these sports societies. They were run in the Soviet Union by the labor unions, which you can imagine in a communist country had quite a bit of power. So the trade unions had like the aircraft industry, food workers, the Army, the Air Force, all of those industries were state funded. And they had at one point exercise programs like in school and for adults that were based more in calisthenics. So things like push-ups, sit-ups, jumping jacks, those types of exercises, which are very regimented, and you can imagine in a communist society that would work pretty well. And at any rate, they found that they were not doing well in the Olympics, and they wanted to have a show of power to show, as many people want to try in the Olympics. If you look at the politics of the Olympics, it's quite interesting. But many people use the Olympics to try to show that their country is superior, and the USSR was certainly no exception. So they started shifting away from these regimented exercise into sports. And they had these sports societies, and they later created elite sports schools. And the way that these were structured is that children were in these sports societies and they would be evaluated. And essentially, beginning when they were 6, 7, 8, sometimes a little bit older, but many of them quite young, they would be taken from their families and entered into these boarding schools for sports. Now, not everyone who played a sport was in these schools. There were many who were in schools where they were kind of Olympic reserve schools, but they went home and that kind of thing. But they really were trying to train an elite group specifically for the Olympics, and children would live there and receive advanced sports training. They could be one sport oriented, where you were only getting training in gymnastics or something, or they could be kind of multi-sport oriented. And these were quite popular. So I have some numbers here. In 1971, there were 3,800 sports schools in the USSR. And by 1991, there were about 6,000. Now, the USSR at that point obviously is not just Russia, it's Russia and all the other countries that it took over at that point, Czechoslovakia and things that became later on republics, right? A number of different countries. So these were criticized in part because there was a lot of verbal abuse. There were sadistic physical punishments and that kind of thing. But I think that the setup here for Ender is very similar to one of these schools, that they have been tracking him, that you have a very powerful government that's been watching his family, that they allowed his family to have a third child, which plays into his psychology, which I'll get into more later. So he is kind of isolated because he is a third, and they are then recruiting him for this elite training to show the power of their country, right? It's not that much different. I don't think it's that big of a stretch. But I think if you didn't grow up in that period of time, or you didn't know about those Olympic sports schools, you might kind of miss the parallel that really they're taking away his childhood. And I think that that's a definite social criticism that Card is trying to make. Another parallel that you could make, and I think kind of an obvious parallel, is to look at child soldiers. Again, for people in this country, that's something that we often don't talk about or think about, but it is a major human rights problem. And there are many organizations such as Human Rights Watch and sorry, blanked on it there for a second. Human Rights Watch and UNICEF and other world relief groups that try to end the use of children in armed conflicts. So primarily boys, but some girls. And here is from UNICEF, which I should remember the name since I have it pulled up here. These boys and girls suffer extensive forms of exploitation and abuse that are not fully captured by the term child soldiers. Warring parties use children not only as fighters, but also as scouts, cooks, porters, guards, messengers, and more. Many, especially girls, are subjected to gender-based violence. Children become part of armed force group for various reasons. Some are abducted, threatened, coerced, manipulated by armed actors. So basically they're taken out of their homes at gunpoint and then they're forced to fight. Others are driven by poverty, compelled to generate income by their families. Still others associate for survival to protect their communities. No matter their involvement, the recruitment and use of children by armed forces is a grave violation of child rights and humanitarian law. Another organization also goes into a little bit of explanation of this. These boys, some as young as 8 years old, serve in government forces and armed opposition groups. They might fight on front lines, participate in suicide missions, act as spies, messengers, or lookouts. Girls may be forced into sexual slavery. Many are abducted or recruited by force. Others join out of desperation, thinking it their best chance for survival. So when Ender is given this choice, you can pretty quickly see that it's not a choice. And then I would really like you to look through the book, look as you go through the book, don't just like flip through the book, but as you read through the book, think about the ways that this really is child abuse. They are separating these kids from their families, but this is not a regular boarding school. They withhold communication. They really play mind games with the boys. They separate Ender specifically because they see leadership potential in him. They are training them to be killers, but the kind of killers that they specifically want. So if they had just taken kids like Peter, who is changes toward the end of the book, but in the beginning of the book is very clearly a sociopath. If they had just taken kids like that, you would have children who are violent, and I will say too that most children who have sociopathic tendencies or who have oppositional defiant disorder, because you're not allowed to call kids sociopaths. But kids who have ODD are often traumatized as well. That does not seem to be the case in Peter's life, but it is in Ender's. He does suffer from trauma. He has almost flashbacks at times, and as he plays these video games, we see a little bit of that trauma come out. But really, the trauma of being recruited into this school, of being forced to play this game, and many kids, older kids, talk about this. The real enemy is the adults. They're pitting the kids against the kids, but they're the real enemy. There are some children there who do not even think the buggers are going to attack again. They're saying, that's basically an impossibility, and we are being trained just for political purposes. And when this whole government thing falls apart, this coalition, almost like a UN, falls apart, we'll be asked to fight, and then we'll be fighting each other for real. So the idea here of having child soldiers, having kids who are elite, being trained for this, being taken almost by force, but definitely by coercion, that Ender is basically told, yes, your sister loves you, but your parents really don't, and they feel kind of two ways about you, and they don't really love you, and they won't miss you. And therefore, it's one of the things that convinces him to go for this military training. So think about those parallels and think about the way that the kids are, if not completely abused, at least, I guess that's not the right word, if not physically abused, at least psychologically manipulated. Another thing that I would like you to look at is Ender's psychology. He really has an intricate understanding of how battles work, even from before he goes to the training. So he has some bullies that approach him at school, and he thinks about how he can end this bullying for good. How much force will he have to use? Will he look like a coward for hitting someone once that person is down? How can he seems to have some understanding of how to fight, either from his brother or from things that he's read, or from his father, or just from the fact that he's a genius. The way that he uses force, the way that he strikes people, the way that he forms a team, there is a lot about the psychology of battle as much as there is the technology of battle. The different people who don't think strategically, and Ender is really almost always playing chess. So that's something that I would like you to look for. How does he have a better understanding of the chessboard and how these pieces come together? For example, a lot of the groups are using formations all the time. So he's like, right, but if you don't fight in a formation and you just come at it from different angles, you can maybe win, because they're only used to fighting in formation. That's something that would have been important a couple years before the book was published, during the Vietnam War, when you have the military in the jungle and they are not fighting the same way that they would have in World War II, for example, where there's trench warfare, maybe World War I. If you think about if you've ever seen how people fought like during the Revolutionary War or during the Civil War, where they kind of all lined up and then fought each other. It's a lot different. Guerrilla warfare is quite different. So it's those kind of things that Ender is experimenting with. So yeah, the military psychology is part of what makes him a leader. The other thing to look for is other aspects of his psychological makeup. I mentioned his trauma. I want you to really look at the sections where he's playing video games, which seem like they might not be that important. But really, what we have is this setup where he is fighting a war all the time, essentially, or preparing to fight, preparing to go into battle, figuring out first how he can fight by himself, using zero gravity to his advantage, and then how he can use a team, and then also in these simulations how the team can attack in the air rather than through hand-to-hand combat. But he also has these times where he's playing this video game, and this is basically like a psychological release for him. He, for a long time, does not have any friends. The friends that he does have, it's more like work colleagues, I guess, in many ways, or allies, and then eventually kind of breaking down those walls to become friends. But they are isolating him so that he cannot rely on anyone, so that he has to become a leader. So he's playing this video game, and it's adaptive, and he cannot get past a certain point, and eventually he gets past that point, which no one else has done before, and then he finds things on the other end that are really adapting to his specific psychology. He has a lot of trauma from his brother, and that is something also that I think Orson Scott Card really captures here. Many children who are abused by siblings, and that is true of physical abuse and sexual abuse, which doesn't happen in this book, but I think, again, as with the homosexuality, there are some undertones there as to how Ender has been abused. Yeah, so he suffers abuse at the hand of his brother, and he suffers from that later. And he has some post-traumatic stress disorder, I think we would say now, from that abuse and from those experiences, and certainly also the experience of really being a wanted child, but also an unwanted child at the same time. So the video game is both his escape and kind of a reflection, almost as if we're getting like dreams, I guess. In a different book, he would be dreaming and we would be talking about the symbolism of the dreams. But here we're going to talk about the symbolism of some of the video games. So I really want you to watch for that. I also want you to see how he matures as the book goes on. I think, as I've said before, he's kind of quite mature for the beginning and doesn't seem like a 6-year-old, but look for the ways in which he does seem like a young kid, and how he's coming of age as the story progresses. Because again, if you look at that hero's journey that we've been talking about this semester, I think you can really see the idea of someone coming of age and coming at least from loneliness to a place of leadership. And this is what he's been trained for, but he also is highly intelligent, and he also is he has the ability for violence, but he also has the ability for empathy. And I think that balancing those two out is a large part of his story. I'm looking to see if I've missed anything here. I think that that's all that I really wanted to say. The violence and the empathy, the idea that he's a third, the idea that he's an outcast, that he's being trained for leadership. Really look at what makes a leader. How are leaders made? People are mentioned here like Napoleon and Julius Caesar, and they want somebody in the major who helped to stop the war the first time. They're looking for somebody who is going to be in the history books and who will be really remembered and revered for all time, and they're looking for that person to be a child and to have the best leader that they can have. These are the extents that we go to for war, but I think also you can say, how do we kind of breed or manipulate or grow leaders or find leaders today, and what qualities do they have? So to wrap everything up, the psychology of leadership, the psychology of someone who has undergone a trauma, who is a child in this situation, kind of like being a child soldier or like being one of the athletes from the USSR. The use of video games as adaptive and as a tool to symbolically show some psychology, the psychology of war and the strategy of war and how that works, and how different leaders try to use their teams or train their teams or manipulate their teams, depending on what that looks like. So look for the psychology of the other leaders as well. And then lastly, as we mentioned before, the sociological aspects of this society, how genetics are manipulated, how these social structures have been put into place of this school, the internet, the way that the other children try to manipulate the media. And then, as I talked about in my last lecture, look for some of those elements that got this book banned or challenged, and some of the ways in which there are still controversies about it. That's it. I can't wait to see your thoughts, and I really am glad to enjoy this book with you, because there's so much more depth to it than just a mere child's book. So I can't wait to see what you think. Thanks, everybody.